Hi, everyone. We'll just give people another minute or so to join, and then we can get started. Okay, great. Let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How to Get the Biggest ROI on Research Applying Market Access Insights Throughout the Product Lifecycle. I'm Jessica Duchen, Vice President at Magnolia Market Access, and over the next 60 minutes, we'll explore how early and ongoing payer insights can maximize the value of research investments and support stronger market access outcomes. We're especially pleased to be joined by our panel of payer experts who will share their perspectives on what truly drives coverage and reimbursement decisions. We've prepared some questions for our panelists, but please add your questions that you might have for them in the chat as well. And as time permits, we'll be asking our panelists audience questions as well. And I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Anna Hunt-Golden, to begin introductions.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. So Jessica Martin-Etchmeyer and I are from Magnolia Market Access, and we're joined by two payer stakeholders who will share their perspectives and offer practical insights on what matters most in research and how to design research with real-world coverage decisions in mind. So I'll pass it over to Dr. Maria Lopes to get us started.
Thank you so much, Anna, and a pleasure to be with a group here today. My name is Maria Lopes. I'm an OBGYN by training. I've been on the payer side for a very long time, about 23 years. My title has been Chief Medical Officer with several different organizations along the way, including some regional plans, national plan, PBM, IDNs. So pleasure to be with a group. And my responsibilities have been formulary management, medical policy development, critical discussions around care management and clinical pathway development, as well as strategic opportunities to improve value, quality care, outcomes, population health. So great to be with a group.
Thank you. All right. Mr. Mike Margeviches?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Anna. Hey, good afternoon where I'm at, or good morning perhaps for others. Great to be here as well. I am with Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield as a pharmacy director. I've been in my role now for over 20 years, where I help out with policy and clinical review. I have a really vital role when I talk to our clients and customers and knowing what groups want in their plans. We are primarily commercial. We have smaller books of Medicare and Medicaid, but with a heavy clinical focus, just as Maria said. So great to be here today. Looking for a great convo.
Thank you. So our session will begin with some brief framing points, and then we'll open up into a moderated discussion with our panelists, and we'll leave time at the end for wrap up and Q&A. So the goal of today's webinar is to explore how pharmaceutical companies can make more strategic decisions about evidence generation, not just for regulatory approval, but for coverage, reimbursement, and ultimately patient access. We'll discuss market research best practices, the importance of the timing of market research, and we'll delve into what payers are really looking for when they evaluate a product, including what types of clinical trial endpoints carry the most weight, and what companies are doing right and sometimes wrong in market research today. And I will now pass it to my colleague Martine, who will start us out with market research best practices.
Great, thanks, Anna. So when we're thinking about maximizing ROI, it's about making sure that the right people see the right value at the right time. And that's where payer market research best practices come into play. So let's start with those right stakeholders. The US healthcare system, as you all know, is highly fragmented. So engaging a broad mix of stakeholders is critical. Commercial insurers, PBMs, they shape coverage formulary decisions, Medicare and Medicaid, bring unique challenges, especially with the state level variability. So integrated medical delivery networks and health systems also play a growing role as they balance that clinical, as was mentioned, and financial risk. So This is really important for us to really understand what that looks like today. Specialty pharmacies are gatekeepers for many of the high-cost therapies, and finally, employer-driven benefit designs can create unique opportunities or hurdles, even depending on workforce health priorities. Timing is everything. You want to start early, even before pivotal trials, so that you can shape access strategy proactively. As your development progresses, we deepen our research to refine value messages and these access strategies. So then, post-launch, you're tracking payer perceptions continuously as coverage and reimbursement landscapes evolve with new evidence, competitor launches, policy changes. And if you only engage payers once, your research insights will really only be representative of a moment in time, and you ultimately risk losing alignment with market reality. So, right methodology, I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but not all the insights are created equal. A mix of qualitative and quantitative approaches really work best. Advisory boards, one-on-one interviews help to uncover nuanced perspectives. Qualitative tools such as surveys or discrete choice modeling can validate and quantify those insights. So together, they provide a holistic, robust evidence base for decision making. Ending on that evidence. So finally, it's really what matters. The clinical trial data are essential, but rarely also sufficient. Payers want to understand the real world impact on patient outcomes, healthcare resource utilization, total cost of care. So that means supplementing your trial evidence with health economic outcomes research, planning early for that real world evidence generation. And the stronger, more relevant your evidence package is, the easier it is to secure access and optimize ROI. So that's how the research becomes not just a box to check, but a significant driver of that return on investment across the product life cycle. So now I'm going to turn it over on the next slide to our panelists and really get their feedback. What makes market research from your perspective high quality?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think it's not just what matters, but who it matters to. And so depending on the disease, depending on the product, depending on the clinical outcomes, the relevance of the endpoints matter as far as, if you're seeing a pharmacy versus, a medical director, does the disease have tangible implications for HEDIS, for STAR measures, and some of the discussions beyond product that really are impactful maybe to the organization in terms of, we talked about best practices, right? But that goes beyond the product discussion many times in terms of coordination of care, real world data generation as far as hospitalizations or ER visits, event rate, and implications for total cost of care. So I would say high quality, first thing you have to ask is who's your audience and what kind of messaging around the outcomes are you able to deliver that creates differentiation for your product in the context of total cost of care, unmet need with the disease, any guideline changes sometimes and how you fit into right patient, right approach, or personalized medicine in terms of who's it for and not for. So to me, that's a teachable. This is a teachable moment when you're bringing to a payer something that's worthy of insights, but insights hopefully that matter in terms of what are we going to do with that information.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you. And Mr. Markovich?
Yeah, so a couple of things that come to mind for me, at least, when you're talking about high quality, when those primary and secondary endpoints are selected for full research, they have to be meaningful. I don't want to see an endpoint for a test that doesn't mean anything in actual practice. Those sorts of things are kind of hollow in my regard. As a health plan, I know that our health plan and most health plans out there are going to be really evidence-based, looking at what not only the data shows in regards to the trial, but real world application goes a long way, because put yourself into our shoes when we're looking at a drug or drug therapies, and there are several different choices, therapeutic options. We have to make tough decisions sometimes, and the high quality research does resonate to the top. And so not only do you eventually become standard of practice, but you see the demand for it, that practitioners are going to those therapies. We don't want to be caught, not prepared for that. So on the front end, going in with that mindset is going to be helpful.
Right. And is there anything that you recommend companies do to best validate payer insights that are and are actionable?
Well, one of the things I would suggest, and this is what we rely on heavily, we don't know what we don't know, and that's why we lean heavily on the KOL community. As these trials are developed, not just to have researchers put pen to paper, but actually speak to practitioners as to what is meaningful, how they see their patients being treated, and then again, set these trials up so it's realistic for that patient pool. That I think will go a long way in making sure that the work that's done to show the value of the product is in fact will bear fruit.
Fantastic.
I
So
think-
I have a lot more. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna spot on. Also if what does goal look like for the particular disease, but also the right comparisons. So what is the standard of care? Even though that standard of care may not have the FDA approval, we're still going to consider it in the context of who's the appropriate patient or medical optimization. If there's scales, and this may come up later, do we understand those scales? What's a clinically meaningful difference as we look at outcomes? And then the relevant comparators so that we're making the appropriate clinical decisions and business decisions.
Perfect. And that segues into my next slide on timing, and we're really going to dig into this because, as you mentioned, the having that meaningful endpoint. And so when one of the biggest mistakes that manufacturers can make is treating payer research as a single event, and you want to really get at what those endpoints are and how they are meaningful. And so you really need to do research in a continuous and iterative process across the development and commercialization life cycle to ensure that at the end you have those meaningful endpoints. So in early development, in these early stages, payer research really should be directional. The goal here is to understand the market landscape, what are some major unmet needs, and what do payers view as meaningful endpoints? Where are their cost pressures? These insights can help with shape trial design, comparators, and endpoints that resonate not just with the regulators, but with these access decision makers that you just heard from. And as we moved into phase 3, payer research deepens. Here we focus on refining value proposition, and you test that draft value message, understanding willingness to reimburse at different price points, identifying evidence gaps that need to be addressed. So this is when health economic modeling and real-world evidence planning should begin in earnest. In pre-launch, the research shifts toward strategy refinement. So we use things like advisory boards and surveys to help anticipate potential coverage hurdles, utilization management restrictions, and contracting needs. And because at the end of the day, these are really important to really understand. And this stage really is about pressure testing that access strategy before going to the market. At launch, on the next slide, you'll see that, payer research provides real-time feedback. You're monitoring initial coverage decisions, understanding how payers are reacting to your value story. Is this what you anticipated? You're identifying any early barriers to access, or these rapid insights here really allow for that tactical adjustment in contracting, in pricing, in evidence dissemination. And then post-launch, when you're in the market for a while, this is important to track ongoing. So payers' perceptions evolve as competitors enter, as new data emerge, as policies shift. So ongoing monitoring ensures that you don't just secure your access at launch, you sustain that and continue that to maximize your product's ROI throughout its life cycle. And by embedding this payer market research across those 5 stages I just reviewed, you can really make more strategic decisions, anticipate the barriers, and protect and grow your return on investment. So on this next slide here, I'm going to go back to our panelists. Can you Can you tell us a little bit more about at what point in the product life cycle you find payer input is most critical?
I'm happy to start again. I think it depends on who you're engaging. If it's clinical, medical pharmacy in preparation for, P&T, usually we see pie presentations, usually closer to when there's a PDUFA date. But if you're planning a budget, and let's say it's in a very large disease state, it's Alzheimer's, it's oncology and large disease states, or where the technology is so unique, like CAR-Ts, we met with pharmaceutical industry probably a year well in advance of the product coming to market because it was so unique and how it was delivered, where it was delivered, settings, the setting of care and centers of excellence that we had to make sure we even had in our network. Think about case rates and what do those include. So it really kind of depends. But probably 80% of the time, if you're meeting with a clinical team, it's closer to when you have a PDUFA date, and maybe more in that phase 3. If you have the opportunity, I think it's always great if you can engage in phase 2 to sort of refine those endpoints and what is clinically meaningful, not just what the FDA says you're going to have to do to come to market, but do you have the right comparators? Because when you launch, we will be looking at the disease, what is the standard of care? How do you compare to that standard of care, even if you didn't do a head-to-head? Is it a clinically meaningful difference? But, pie presentations are, I think, really important because in the P&T discussion, it's very, very quick. We'll usually, it's 7-8 minutes for, one product, and then we move on to the next one and the next one. So the more insight we have into the disease, the more important that pie presentation becomes, the rarer the condition, because we may not know much about the condition. We may not know much about the prevalence. We may not know much about the standard of care or KOL, input. So those are the kinds of insights that I think are really, really helpful in contextualizing the disease, the unmet need, the current standard of care, what a difference your product will make, and also who's appropriate for it. And really, I think, prepare us, and not just for your product, but potentially even for what else, may be coming that highlights how it's going to deliver value for that condition.
Yeah, I'm going to chime in very much the same sort of perspective, but I think I'm going to take just a little bit different perspective on that. So we, as an organization, have a pipeline team that's coordinated by a group of folk, and we routinely get updates from the pipeline. But the perspective of a manufacturer when they come to us is usually their universe is their drug, right? However, when you put the perspective of a health plan where we've got to deal with 20 drugs, or in case of a pipeline report, it could be dozens and dozens of drugs that are on there. We got to cherry pick. We got to select the ones that are getting the most focus, that are going to have biggest financial impact or clinical impact, and sort of run our resources toward those. And that usually means imminent approval, which further means is that 6 months or so, before launch, PDUFA date, that's the right window. Maria's spot on that. If you go out much further than that for a product that's coming down 24 months from now, or 18 months from now, forget about it. We're going to forget about it, for one. Two, we're not our life cycle is not that long. We're worried about drug spend and trend with the perspective of 6 to 18 months at most. And so to, the what ifs that going on in the world that might come eventually, that's wasted breath. So I would suggest phase 3 or late phase 3 is probably the right range, certainly for the clinical reviews and those PI decks. I can't really speak that well to the financial and the contracting. That usually happens after approval because we don't see much pricing before that. So anyway, I'll stop.
Great insights. Oh, Dr. Lopes, would you like to add?
Yeah, I was going to say some of the best practices that I'm seeing from pharma these days in that pie presentation actually involve some depth in terms of my population. Pulling codes, ICD-10 codes. So when we're talking about a 1 million member plan, what's my exposure going to be? And I think this speaks to, Mike's issue of, is this something I have to worry about? Is this going to drive PMPM spend? How much demand there is? But actually, more certainty around budget projections. So pulling codes, helping me really assess, budget spend and trend. Because again, that leads me to the sort of critical insights that I'm going to need in terms of how much attention am I going to pay to this.
Excellent. And then, Mr. Markovich, what about who from your team we should engage at what point?
Yeah, right. So again, the way our plan does it is we actually have an SME who's responsible from our drug information team to present the information at formulary and P&T. That's going to be the person in the organization that will know the most about the drug and the condition better than anybody else. And that person that's part of their homework and pulling all the information together is in fact talking to pharma. They pull clinical trials. They look at white papers, of course. They look at what the FDA opinions are on a particular drug or drug class. But again, part of that is speaking directly to the manufacturer, their science liaisons, to get a little bit more color behind the trials that were done. That is a must. And then eventually, like I said, when the product is ready for launch or makes the shelf, they're going to want to engage with our contractors, of course, and see how it stacks up against other drugs in similar use, same space perhaps. Or it doesn't, or if it's unique, or if it's orphan or rare, and that sort of thing, and then figuring out pricing therein. So those are the who's more than anybody else. Medical directors could be part of that as well, if necessary, but the heavy lifting is going to be done by the drug info team, no question.
Great. And then we talked about PI, we talked about 6 to 18 months. What about when data evolve? When would you like to have a visit from pharma again to review additional insights?
I don't know that a visit is required, to be honest with you. If the product's on formulary, we've done the review. We've seen it. If there is updated real-world evidence that we may need to be made aware of, typically that's handled electronically or maybe a webinar, that sort of thing, if it's really, really critical. Remember that this stuff is coming out all the time. And for us to, for me to review the latest study on somebody's cancer drug for the 5th tumor type, wow, it's interesting, sure, important, sure, probably more if you're an oncologist, but to a health plan, we're just going to sort of chalk it up to add one more to the pile. So, yeah, that's more the perspective, I would guess.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And I think an email with a good executive summary is a best practice, right? So easy to read, bullets, maybe the reference, so that if you have more time, can take you there, could share. But even updates as far as, additional indications. What's also valuable is if there are guideline changes. Any again, pipeline, what else may be coming. This is really, helpful. But I totally agree with Mike. There's not enough time in the day if we're going to meet with every time there's new data. Many times also the data is interesting, but it may not be even compelling enough to do anything with. So it's informational. And unless it's published, we often, going back to that level of evidence-based care, does it rise to that level?
Mhm. Great. So, and then interest of time, I'm going to skip to the next slide and not go through this in detail. Just wanted to point out here, that there is no single methodological approach to payer research that is sufficient on its own. It's critical to really choose the right methodology to answer these questions that our panelists have mentioned, really getting that right evidence to meaningful evidence to payers. So the strength of the evidence directly determines their confidence in coverage and reimbursements decisions, which you've heard from them as well. So we'd really want to focus on the evidence that translates into that real world value using a variety of methods. And opening it back up to the panelists again on this slide here. So what are, let's start with Dr. Lopes. What are your biggest evidence gaps that you see when a new therapy comes to market?
Well, definitely, most trials are short-lived, right? They're a few weeks, few months. Sometimes we see data out to 52 weeks. But, we're really challenged many times to understand, is the treatment effect durable, right? With gene therapies, that's a critical question because there's a big upfront cost. So are you going to respond? Is there going to be durability of effect? Are there going to be repeat treatments? Is this offset for any other expensive medications, procedures, et cetera? So data gaps that help us project what the value of the treatment is in the context of numbers needed to treat, ROI, offsets around total cost of care. So the other big challenge is often the comparators, we don't have head-to-head. So absent a head-to-head study, we end up with indirect comparisons, looking at what is standard of care, sometimes asking KOLs what is standard, and pulling from the literature or involving thought leaders and looking at the trial design, the delta versus the placebo, or if it's a single arm trial, how does this compare with what we already have? So these are all major gaps, both in terms of time as well as comparative data, that hopefully with real world data, some of this can be filled in terms of, is there a real differentiation or it's more of a Me Too drug? The MOA doesn't also answer the question. Just because it's a different MOA, and we always say, well, that's interesting, but what's the so what of the MOA? So the critical endpoints around what's the value, how does it address unmet need, and how does it compare with other current options, not just those that are FDA approved, but standard of care is really important.
Great. And Mr. Mergovich, would you like to add anything on that one?
Yeah, sorry, it's tough to add on to that. That is so well said. The longevity of conditions that are chronic, always gets my craw. We have somebody that has a cardiac or a respiratory condition, and duration of their illness is going to be decades long, and we're presented with a 26-week trial. It's kind of, again, just kind of, okay, that's fine, but and you need to know how this patient is going to be longer term. Again, secondary endpoints are not always to have completed at the time of launch, and I recognize that there's a push to get a product to market because of the investment, for sure. But secondary and tertiary evidence that shows treatment down the road. I think of the PCSK9 class, where evidence and cardiac avoidance came out a full 5 years after launch. And it took that long for us to recognize that there was, long-term outcome benefit there, as opposed to just changing or chasing rather a cholesterol level or a triglyceride level, for heaven's sakes. So again, you're looking to get buy-in and support from the health plan community. We really do want to see the value, and sometimes you just got to wait till we get it.
Great. And I'm going to stick with you for a second. So Beyond clinical evidence, how important is it for you to see patient-reported outcomes, cost-effectiveness research? How do you use those types of data?
Yeah, PROs are interesting, but not always actionable or useful. It's difficult for us to justify a decision on a formulary level based upon, I'll say, the opinions of patients or their perceptions. Maybe that's a little bit softer way of saying that. It's not that we're not sympathetic. We appreciate patients that they can work and they're pain-free and they're feeling pretty good enough to play with the grandchildren and all that stuff. That's all great, but that stuff, that type of data is not really reproducible. I call it squishy or soft data. Sure, it's there, and again, we're all human. We do appreciate that, but we simply won't use it. So anyway, that's that. Healthcare resource utilization or other resources. I would tell you that our plan, and I think most plans, are rather conservative in their willingness to book any potential savings based upon a single therapy. Nobody wants the rope to hang their own noose, right? When they're out there and their and the actuarial team has got to bless these and then go to market and set premiums based on that stuff. And then if your assumptions are not spot on, then you're on thin ice. So as a general rule, I know that most analyst teams won't use any potential cost offset based upon the claims of a product.
Excellent, thank you. That's very valuable. And I know you talked about the PCSK9 example. Are there any other examples of where evidence was presented, stronger evidence becomes available that might have changed your decision in terms of coverage?
Yeah, I thought of another one, SGLT2s. When we saw Jardiance and Farxiga came out with heart protection, that moved the needle. Those two products moved up to preferred status simply because of that. Back in the day, for those that are old like me, you remember when Crestor came out and showed cardiovascular risk protection where the other statins did not. It suddenly went from a tier 3 drug to a tier 2 and no steps because of that, really.
Excellent, great examples. Dr. Lopes, do you have any that you would like to share?
Yeah, I do. And I completely agree with what Mike said. I think PROs are interesting, but it's also how you tell the story of PROs, because we tend to tune off when we hear PROs. But when PROs actually are measuring disease, and I'll give some examples, asthma, we have the asthma control questionnaire. That's a validated tool. It ties to hospitalizations. It ties to resource use. Maybe IBD with Crohn's and UC. Maybe again, pain. Do you have response? Do you have remission? So they're more than just patients like it, right? They tie to validated tools that may mean something in terms of response and even maybe even predictive of an impending hospitalization or ER visit. Some examples where it has mattered. I'm old, so I'll cite Advair. Advair mattered because it had implications for total cost of care, just like the examples Mike mentioned. They changed the guidelines, they changed the standard, and they tied to multiple clinical benefits, not just one. We're seeing this now play out with GLPs, right? Multiple indications, heart disease, cardiac protection, hospitalizations. And then I'll cite two others, Hep C, a cure. HIV PrEP, convenience matters in terms of clinical outcomes and disease spread, right? So, and also to a point where from a legislative perspective, we have to cover these agents. So, the dots connect nicely when the PROs translate into total cost and healthcare resource utilization and ultimately move guidelines.
Fantastic. Very well said. Thank you very much. I'm going to now hand this over to Anna for the next slide.
Yeah, thank you, Martine. So maximizing ROI in research is strongly tied, of course, to the selection of appropriate clinical trial endpoints. And that starts with thinking beyond regulatory approval and instead putting on your payer hat to consider what endpoints will best align with payer priorities. With respect to endpoints, payers value evidence-based medicine and clinically relevant endpoints that are well suited to the trial population that matter to patients, as we were just talking about. Survival, reduction hospitalizations, improved quality of life, rather than solely relying on surrogate endpoints. So these endpoints should demonstrate an understanding of the disease state and its severity and unmet needs. Next, comparative value. Endpoints that compare directly to standard of care carry more weight than placebo-controlled results alone. Clear evidence of a trial of a treatment's incremental benefit helps payers justify both a product's clinical and financial value. Moving on to health system impact. Endpoints that demonstrate reductions in hospitalizations, ER visits, or long-term complications might make a strong case for coverage. So economic relevance is important. Payers want to see how endpoints translate into real cost or real-world cost savings or avoidance. Next, generalizability, which is of course very important to payers. It should reflect outcomes, or endpoints should reflect outcomes across diverse and representative patient populations. So not just narrow trial cohorts. If endpoints don't translate to the patients payers actually see in their plans, coverage and confidence in coverage decisions is reduced. And then durability of benefit is, of course, important. Endpoints that demonstrate sustained efficacy and long-term safety are more persuasive than short-term data, as we've discussed. Durability matters because payers must budget for therapies over years, not months. And of course, there are patients that live with chronic conditions that require treatment. And finally, surrogate versus validated endpoints. So while regulatory approval often hinges on surrogate endpoints, payers are cautious unless those markers are well validated and have a proven relationship to long-term patient outcomes. Unvalidated surrogates often create uncertainty, which can delay or limit coverage decisions. So in short, companies should think beyond regulatory approval and select trial endpoints that align with payer priorities. So meaningful clinical outcomes and evidence-based medicine, validated endpoints, comparative effectiveness, economic relevance, and real-world generalizability. So let's hear from our panelists on the topic of clinical trial endpoints. Which trial endpoints have the greatest impact on your reimbursement decisions? If you want to start,
Yeah,
Dr.
I'll
Lopes, or
go first
okay.
on
Yeah.
that one. I mean, so we want it all. I mean, your previous slide hit every every touch point that really resonates. We want long term, we want realistic, we don't want surrogates, we want economic value. Again, and we also recognize, we also want head to head, and we want ice cream on Sundays too. So it doesn't always align, however. So I would suggest those endpoints that are demonstratable and, again, realistic, and that have strong evidence behind them are the ones that really those are the best ones. Those are, again, that's the first question we ask. As a health plan, we want to make sure that drugs we select to pay for work, for heaven's sakes, even if it's expensive. We just we don't want to waste money, and so the drugs we select must work, and those endpoints that can show that are the ones that really mean a lot.
Thank you. Dr. Lopes, do you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, I think that's so true, right? We also want to know, do they work, but also sometimes is there a compendia diagnostic that helps us identify where they're going to work, who's the right patient where they're going to work, whether it's especially if they're high cost, biologics for COPD, right, may have a biomarker that helps us define, those is this not only where the drug was studied, but compared to standard of care, how much clinical benefit, especially if we're adding significant cost, how much clinical benefit do we see in hospitalizations, in ER visits, in readmissions, particularly 30-day readmissions. So these are some of the things we want to see. Long term, we live in a world, and you kick this off with this fragmentation, right? Commercial members with a payer on average for 24, 36 months. So, what does long term mean? Nobody's going to have 10 years of data. But, a year of data, if you're talking about gene therapy, maybe 2 years, 18 months to 2 years is probably going to have to be, required, not assumed, but required so that we can understand whether a treatment's really durable and what other, is it really delaying disease? And it takes that long, right? For some disease states, if you're studying the drug early on, like Alzheimer's as well, for you to develop enough data that really answers the question of disease modification, time to progression, time to next stage of disease. Because to Mike's point, what we're paying for needs to be validated in terms of where's the clinical data that supports some of these questions. And then surrogate endpoints, again, we love surrogate endpoints that have some predictability to long-term benefit. One example in oncology is MRD. To what extent is MRD a predictor at a certain time point of long-term clinical benefit? In Alzheimer's, if we're reducing beta amyloid or tau, how does this relate to function? Or even how long do we continue the treatment? So there's a lot of gaps many times in knowledge, and with evidence hopefully comes more assurance of, do we have the right surrogate markers and what do they mean clinically over the longer haul?
Thank you. Thanks. And do you think pharmaceutical companies are doing enough to connect clinical endpoints with cost and utilization outcomes?
The answer for me is, it's never enough, right? Because again, depending on who your audience and these clinical endpoints that, may not be apparent at 12 weeks or even 6 months. So the importance of, again, real world data generation, I think becomes critical, but not just, any real world. I think we have to think about what are the analytics, what's the question that we're asking of the data that's going to be meaningful and actionable to move the needle in terms of coverage criteria. I also always think about what's the cost of failure, especially if we're putting steps in the way of a more expensive drug. Tell us about why those steps are perhaps not the most appropriate, and that gets at the heart of, show me data that by doing steps, I'm increasing cost, not decreasing cost. And we're talking about total cost. But that's always really, really important if you're getting me to, focus on the value of a product instead of its cost.
Interesting. Thank you. Mr. Margevicius, anything to add?
No, nothing significant, at least. I mean, again, I think the mindset and the perspective of pharma frequently is how quickly I can get the drug to market and how quickly can I get it selling. The investments, the stakeholders and shareholders are all expecting, quick returns. It doesn't always jive with what goes on in real life. And, from a clinical perspective, medicine is generally practiced relatively slow. We're not aggressively pushing. So those endpoints, the real one, and they just take time.
Thank you. This is all very insightful. Thank you. So we've spoken about market research best practices and the importance of the timing of research and the selection of trial endpoints, strengths and weaknesses of evidence from a payer perspective. So now we're going to speak to payer market research itself to support coverage and reimbursement and its role in de-risking market access strategy. So with respect to the timing of market research that Martine spoke about, another useful way to look at the ideal timing of payer market research is to break it down first into clinical development and then into value-driven coverage and access strategy. With respect to clinical development, early on, payer research plays a critical role in shaping clinical programs. First, it helps design trials, which generate data payers actually care about. And that means aligning endpoints with outcomes that resonate with payers. And it also ensures that you're choosing the right comparator, because payers will scrutinize whether your trial design reflects the real treatment landscape. And importantly, it allows you to anticipate HEOR and RWE needs. So those are built into the plan from the start rather than are added on later. Value-driven coverage and access strategy. Once you're past the trial stage, payer research becomes the foundation for building a compelling value story. It gives you the evidence needed to justify pricing and to improve the likelihood of broader access with fewer restrictions. You can do a number of different things. You can test payer willingness to pay and identify acceptable price ranges, which helps avoid surprises at launch. Payer market research allows you to refine messaging for your value dossier and payer-facing materials so they resonate with decision makers. You can also pressure test how payers might react to your anticipated formulary placement, tiering, and utilization management. And finally, you can assess contracting preferences, whether rebates or innovative models like outcomes-based agreements are most valuable. This step also highlights where RWE or PRO data in your evidence plan might be missing and where you'll need to invest. So payer market research is not just about asking questions, it's really about de-risking your market access strategy. And by embedding payer insights into both the clinical development and coverage planning processes, companies can position their therapies for faster, broader, and more sustainable access. So over to our panelists for some thoughts on this. Other than conducting a head-to-head trial, what advice would you give manufacturers to ensure clinical trial evidence translates into real-world payer relevance?
So we are doing cartwheels if we get head-to-head data, but so rarely do we get it. As a result, we end up doing meta-analysis, looking at similar endpoints from similar products, similar trials, and just sort of, spreadsheeting them right next to each other. And, these numbers look like this, and this tends to, on paper at least, looks like to be, but we're careful to make that notation when we have our discussion in the analysis. Again, this is the value of a KOL saying, okay, you have real world experience using these products next to each other. What do you think? And that sort of thing really makes that is influential. There's no doubt about it. So the preference always would be head to head, or at least if it's not head to head, use something that is realistic for a trial. We recognize that placebo-based trials are the minimum bar that needs to be met. So we got to go with that. But we, again, want more.
Okay.
I
Dr.
agree.
Lopes?
I
Yeah.
agree. But even if we have head to head, I have to say that we're looking for not just statistical significance, but many times we are looking at, is it superior, right? Is this clinically superior to what we already have, especially if it's generic versus high cost brand? We want that answer as far as, is this a clinically meaningful difference as far as superiority and what that represents? But I completely agree. We do rely on KOLs, to help us understand what this delta may represent and maybe anticipate demand. We also use guidelines, and particularly when, product may not even be in guidelines, but the guidelines outline a whole algorithm that supports many times the reasons we do what we do, the prior authorization, the step therapies. We are totally aligned with guidelines, and we use those, to our, advantage to say and justify where a product should be used, and what the standard of care is as defined by the guidelines. And we know they lag. So again, the importance of real world data that helps to shape what those guidelines look like. And again, SGLTs are a great example. GLPs are a great example. Asthma, COPD, right, where the biologics belong, right in line with, how payers think about right patient, right approach. And then something that doesn't always help pharma, but identifying the right population. It doesn't help everyone to say, well, give it to all. But through data, if we really can identify biomarkers or characteristics where, looking back, this is where it matters. This is where you get high response. This is where, you get impact on survival, particularly in oncology. I think those are some of the things that we really value in terms of getting credibility to the drug and the pharmaceutical company for thinking that way. And don't expect to be frontline for everything, right? If the standard of care is already outlined and, looking at inexpensive agents, your trial design should reflect that so that we know, again, who's appropriate and at what point we should introduce the drug.
Thank you. Very interesting. Thanks. And just briefly, one more question on this slide in the interest of time. How do you see contracting and rebating evolving?
Well, there's
I don't,
still,
yeah, go ahead.
go
Go
ahead.
ahead, Maria. You go first.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly more of a focus around outcomes. I want to say also value-based care, but I could probably, a lot of the value-based contracting that exists is very, very difficult to operationalize, and some of it doesn't really tie to the long-term outcomes we want to see. They many times tie to a type of surrogate marker. PCSK9s are, a good example of, LDL. We're measuring LDL because that's short term. We, are not really measuring outcomes and event rate. And with gene therapy is, again, very, very challenging because the whole issue around what are we collecting? Does it matter? How do we, the portability around the data, if somebody leaves the plan, what happens then in terms of repatriating dollars? So my advice is you have to keep it simple. And some of the things that keep it simple are certainty around the spend or capping the expense. So, if you need to redose a high cost drug, we're not going to see that cost. But, I think we have to figure out some of these value-based agreements, especially around the certainty. They're a huge, this whole area of rare and orphan. And also for employer groups, they're representing, a bigger and bigger contribution to budget spend and trend. Affordability is becoming a bigger issue. And so that it has to tie to some outcomes that we can clearly not only define, but measure what their impact are around total cost of care.
Thank you. Mr. Margeviches, anything
Yeah,
on
just
that?
a real quick. She's
Yeah.
right. I mean, value-based deals are tough, really, really difficult. Um, you know, just the data collection, number of folks that are going to be impacted by that, the true up at the end of the deal or the term, agreeing on the data. I think if I was a contractor, I'm not, thank God, but if I were a contractor, it'd be just as simple to ask for a couple of extra points as opposed to going through all that work and getting that taken care of via a value-based deal. It's difficult. And I've been doing this over 20 years. And I remember when I started in this industry that those were the cat's meow back then. And don't you think if we would have figured it out by now, how to do this easily and successfully, there'd be widespread use. The truth of the matter, they're not. So.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks. So we're going to go here to our last slide, some key takeaways from today's webinar. So to wrap up, the ROI on research is highest when payer insights are built in early and revisited often. And the best evidence packages balance what regulators need and what payers value. So ultimately, strong research doesn't just get products approved, it gets them covered, reimbursed, and into the hands of patients who need them. So I want to thank our panelists today for their perspectives, and we have a few wrap-up questions for them. So if you could give one piece of advice to pharmaceutical companies about generating evidence that truly matters to payers, what would it be? Do you want to start, Mr. Margeviches?
I was thinking just bring the donuts when you come visit, but that won't fly, I don't think. Again, I go back to those endpoints, those evidence-based primary endpoints that are meaningful to patient care. That to me still resonates as the top priority.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Dr. Lopes?
Yeah, I would also add, the disease state, right patient, and how your product's addressing unmet need, whether it's a rare disease, an orphan disease, competitive market where many products already, exist. Unless you can answer the question of how are you addressing unmet needs, and then what are the relevant endpoints that help to address that, there's a challenge, right, in getting your message across value.
Okay. Thank you. And as healthcare moves toward value-based care, what kinds of evidence will become even more important in your decision making over the next 12 to 18 months? Do you want to start us out, Dr. Lopes, with this one?
Sure. We talked about some of this, and this is ties to total cost of care, other cost offsets, whether it's pharmacy or medical, event rate, hospitalizations, ER visits, healthcare resource utilization. Primarily, mostly direct costs. That's what payers focus on. You may be gathering, data also around indirect costs, the productivity, we talked a little bit about patient-reported outcomes, but the ones that really usually matter to the payer are going to be the direct cost offsets, and usually try to, keep in mind, kind of the short term, 12, 18 months, and how your product can deliver on some type of clinical benefit.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Margeviches, anything about this timeline, decision making over the next 12 to 18 months?
Nothing specific. I mean, there is a trend within the industry to reimburse providers based upon value, what the outcomes are, right? And a good surrogate is going to be total cost of care, just like what Maria said. It's easier to done with some practices than others, but at the end of the day, there's no doubt that we are interested in going or furthering, I guess, evidence-based performance by practitioners. So,
Okay, thank you. And then finally, if you had to summarize in one sentence, what does pharma need to do differently to ensure their research delivers maximum ROI and supports coverage? You want to
Well, I
start us,
think
Dr. Lopes? Yeah.
Sure. There's this gap and tension, I think, between what the FDA allows you or wants you to do, and ultimately, as you heard, what payer expects. And so, it's thinking in mind, what does a payer expect? So that hopefully you have the right endpoints, you're building those into the trial, even if you don't need them for the, FDA approval. But I think ultimately that's how you bridge this gap in terms of not just being evidence-based, but does it matter? Does your product matter in the context of unmet need and the disease state?
Thank you. Mr. Margeviches?
I was going to say does very much the same thing. I was just thinking the example of you have a product brought to market in a very crowded class. We've already got all these immunologicals, TNFs and alphas and jacks, and look at. I mean, do we need another one? Do we really need another one? And so again, the perspective of a plan is how much is enough in whether it matters or not is big. There's no doubt.
Okay. Thank you. Jessica, do we have any questions? Do we have one question or?
Yeah, we had a question come in related to PROs, and the question is, if PROs are not really considered when making decisions, why do you think there's this increased focus on PROs?
Well, CMS cares about PROs. I think there's more of a focus from CMS. Also, patients, it's what matters to patients. The question is, how do you make it matter to payers? And the way to matter that makes it matter to payers is by helping us understand, are there things in the PROs that help us identify response, or identify maybe healthcare predictors of healthcare resource utilization, and then the comparative data that gets us to be able to understand the cross different trial designs, some that may not even have captured PROs, to what extent that they matter. But I think there's more emphasis on the part of CMS to understand what is the what does the patient think.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you. Oops. Thank you for For your time today, we'd like to extend a sincere thank you to Dr. Maria Lopes and Mr. Mike Margeviches for imparting your insights on us today. And Jess, I hand it over to you.
Great. Yeah, well, that's all the time we have for today. Again, our sincere thank you to our panelists. Your perspectives have added tremendous value to this discussion, and we hope you can join us for our webinar next month. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.